So to finish off, Victorian religion, based on the book, there is at least one copy of this book in the British Studies Centre, but I will also upload the ebook to Moodle. Elizabeth J. Faith and Doubt in Victorian Britain. It's the book from the 1980s, so it's not very recent, but it's rather short and it gives a nice overview. So what is there to remember? First of all, that the Anglican Church is the national church in Britain. Queen Victoria is the head of the Church of England, and she was a believer, but she was not really a fanatic, from what we can gather. For most of the Victorian period, the Anglican Church suffers the same kind of internal divisions and internal tensions as many other areas of the society. So what we have is the two principal types of Anglicanism. One is called the Low Church, the other is called the High Church. The Low Church is sometimes called the Evangelical movement. This is the movement which is, I would say, more Protestant, more Puritan than the High Church, although they are both within the Church of England. There are some other Protestant denominations present in Britain. They would normally be called dissenters, so the Protestants who are not Anglican, so people like Methodists, for example. Or Calvinists, they might be called, they usually in Victorian literature are called dissenters. And so let's start with the Church of England, the High Church and the Low Church. The Low Church is called the Evangelicals, and it's more Protestant of the two. They generally believed in the importance of personal worship, so the most important religious practice for them was reading the Bible. That is why the evangelicals supported education of the poor. They supported promoting literacy, so even the poor and the people living in the country, in small villages, might get enough education to be able to read the Bible for themselves, because for the Low Church, reading the Bible was the most important form of religious practice. They had a very classical Protestant view that faith was the most important thing, so you needed to believe in God and then to try and have some sort of personal relation with God, rather than to have a very developed and visible and beautiful church. This is the domain of the High Church, really. So the Low Church was mostly connected with village life, with small towns. This wasn't an intellectual movement. This was this kind of good old-time religion for many people, something they associated with the previous generations, with the simple life of people before the urbanization. There might be some elements going back to Puritanism, so if any of the wings of the Church of England was still, I would say, stern and try to instill the fear of God into the flock, this would be the Low Church rather than the High Church. So the High Church, on the other hand, was, I would say, more Catholic than the Low Church, not to the point of ever accepting the supremacy of the Pope, but in the style and imagery and worship connected with this church. So it's sometimes called the Anglo-Catholic Church, the High Church. It's the church that is connected with the Gothic revival style. So the fascination with the visual side of the Middle Ages, the beautiful neo-Gothic church with wood carvings, with stained glass windows, with all kinds of decorations, sometimes in bright colors. So Augustus Pugin, we may have talked about him already. The art historian and architect and designer, he was especially fascinated with the Gothic style. So he designed many churches for the Anglican Church, but for the High Church wing. And they were very often built in relatively poor working class neighborhoods to make the church attractive visually. Pugin said he wanted to make the church more attractive than the local pub, so to attract people to worship God rather than to drink alcohol. I'm not sure he was very successful, but at least he tried. Another type of church-related issues concerning the High Church is that it was more intellectual. It is connected with the so-called Oxford movement, of which John Newman would be the principal leader. And these were the intellectuals, mostly working at universities, especially the University of Oxford. Many professors were members of the Anglican clergy, and more often than not, if they were, they would follow the High Church wing of the Church of England. So the kind of Protestantism centered on art, beauty, and also philosophy and this kind of intellectual pursuits. For the Low Church clergy, the Bible was basically the only book they needed. For the High Church clergy, they wrote and published essays. The essays are sometimes called tracts. So another word for the High Church and the Oxford movement is the Tractarians. The Tractarians, because they published those essays on religious and moral matters, and this was really something that was gaining popularity, especially among the urban population, among the more wealthy and educated parts of the British middle class. So they believed in ritual, they believed in beautiful music, in beautiful vestments, so the clothes worn by the clergy, and sometimes they were almost like the Catholic Church, with the only exception of the internal organization of the church itself. So they never accepted the supremacy of the Pope. It was quite ritualistic. So that's the situation around the middle of the 19th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, we have the first attempts to let's say, create some sort of middle road, and this middle road is called the Broad Church. The Broad Church was, I would say, most inclusive. It was connected with, let's say, charitable works and social progress, and basically trying to adjust the teachings of the church to modern society, to modern life. Some of the members of the Broad Church, some of the intellectuals connected with Broad Church, you might say, flirted with socialism. So it became a kind of social charity with not so much emphasis put on theology and strictly religious matters. It was also a kind of patriotic church that tried to celebrate Englishness rather than, let's say, engage in some religious disputes. So we have the High Church and the Low Church, and then, as an attempt to reconcile them, the Broad Church. We have, of course, other Protestant denominations, so those dissenters. We have the rather visible movement towards the emancipation of other religions, non-Protestant religions, such as the Jews or the Muslims. They are given the freedom of worship, and eventually even the Catholics, after a few centuries of being persecuted, they are given the freedom of worship and they can worship openly. The church organization and hierarchy are re-established, so the Catholics who wished to worship their religion could do it. We are talking about the middle of the 19th century as well. I guess 1850 was the year when the law was passed. So the limitations that were very many at first, so you needed to be the member of the Church of England. They didn't specify High Church or Low Church or Broad Church, but the member of the Church of England, the worshipper of the Church of England, to hold many official positions, especially to sit in Parliament, also to go to university. The most important oath that a person could take in Britain in the 19th century, at least in the first half of the 19th century, was to swear allegiance to the monarch as the head of the Church of England. So with the gradual increase of toleration, this is diminished. I think the last points to remain are that Catholic priests could not become members of Parliament. Normal lay Catholics could, and that the British monarch or future British monarch could not marry a Catholic person. So that was, I think, something that remained. And of course we have the whole growing movement towards secularization, towards, let's say, the acceptance of religious doubt, which grows from the philosophical implications of the theory of evolution. Also, it is very much connected with the study of geology that was very popular in the 19th century, and one of the things it proved was that the earth was much older than what was stated in the Bible. So what started as looking for physical evidence for the truthfulness of the Bible grew relatively quickly into replacing religious thinking with scientific thinking. So that's what we have here. So if you want more, read the book. It will be uploaded, so you can find it easily. And that's it for this week. Thank you.